Hi, everyone. Just a quick review of the Biblical Hebrew verbal system. So I started explaining the Hebrew verbal system by using an analogy, which may or may not work for you. But I used cars. And I talked about how there are different brands of cars. There's Toyota, Chevrolet, Honda, Volkswagen, Fiat, and Tesla. Um, there are other brands that we could have listed here, but the screen is only so big. So I picked those. And each of these brands differ slightly. So if you're really a car aficionado, you can look at a car and tell right away whether it's a Honda or a Fiat. Sometimes Toyotas and Hondas, if you're not paying too much attention, maybe those are harder to differentiate. So you could say that probably a car brand like a Fiat or a Tesla, they're a little bit more unusual. They stand out. They're easy to identify. Maybe some other brands aren't as easy to identify. But ultimately, they're just different kinds of cars. They all get you from point A to point B. They all have four wheels. Um, and they're cars. They're different brands of cars, but they're cars. So we don't think too much about the different brands in terms of their function. Then within each brand, there are also sort of consistent types of cars. And um, Here we might look at compact cars. So all of the brands have a compact car, all of the brands have a standard size car. Most of them have full size cars, not all. Some of them make SUVs, some of them don't. Probably fewer brands make pickups. Maybe a few more make minivans, but not all the car brands make all the different types of cars. So some specialized in certain things and some specialize in other things. In the biblical Hebrew verbal system, we might think of the specific patterns of verbs as something similar to types of cars, um, or brands of cars. So the verbal patterns are um, the most common ones are call, pl, hifil, nifal, hithpael, pual, hofal, hishtafel, and then there's probably five or six others, some of which only occur maybe one time in the Hebrew Bible. Um, just to stop for a second, in this class, I'm going to call these uh, verbal patterns, and probably mostly because that's the term that your author uses. If you look at other textbooks or talk to different instructors, they might use terms like different stems, or they might use the Hebrew term binyan, which means building or structure. So take your pick. There's no standardized terminology, but I'll just call them or try to stick to the term verbal pattern. And then down the side, we have different types of verbs. These are all the types. I'm not holding anything back on you here. So there are Vav consecutive verbs. We talked about those already last week. They begin with Vavs. They're very kind of easy to figure out, in my opinion. We also have imperfect verbs, which we haven't talked about too much yet. Perfect verbs, which we did talk about last week. So the perfect verb type, again, not that they're any better than the other types of verbs, um, are are distinct because they have suffixes instead of prefixes. So the Vav consecutive is kind of distinctive because it has prefixes, sometimes suffixes, but always prefixes, whereas the perfect verbs have no prefixes but always have suffixes. Then we have imperative verbs, and these are used for giving commands. We have infinitive absolute, which are used for intensifying verbal action. We have infinitive construct, which is used for in the same way that English infinitive works. So, like to run, to give, to sit, to fly, to stand, etc. So that is called the infinitive in English, and this basically performs the same function in Biblical Hebrew. And then finally, we have the form called the jussive, which has to do with things that we would like to see happen, that we wish would happen, that we want to have happen, but maybe are not quite sure that they will happen. So this matches up more or less with what is sometimes called the subjunctive in English. So would, might, maybe, let, um, those kinds of ideas fit under the jussive. And we'll be talking about each of these verbs in a great more detail um, going on and into the next quarter. Now notice that not all verb forms have all of the types of verbs. So Nephal, for example, doesn't have any infinitive absolutes. Hithpael doesn't have any infinitive absolutes. Hishtafel only has vav consecutives and imperfects. So I say that with a little asterisk or caveat, due to the fact that when I say they don't have any of these forms, I have to say that we don't have any for us in the Hebrew Bible. Now, of course, the Hebrew Bible is only a small sample of um, a much broader spoken language, so it's possible that these forms did exist in the language and that we just don't have examples of them in the Bible. But I don't know, some of them kind of make sense. As you go along, you might see why a Nephal, probably an infinitive absolute, might not work very well in a Nephal form. But anyway, just to show you they don't all exist in all of the verbal patterns. Now, in this course, I try to do my best to concentrate on the things that give you the most bang for the buck. So we could think that all of these verbal patterns are equally distributed in the language, but that is really not true. The call pattern is named thus because it is sort of the easy pattern or the most common pattern, and this chart shows you the relative frequency of each of these types of verbs. So obviously we'll be spending way more time on call, hifil, pl, and nephal than we will on some of the more obscure verb types, and that's just because we have to prioritize our time. So the blue lines in this bar graph show the total numbers of forms of each type. So doing this, you can get a good sense that there are a lot of call verbs, and within call, there are a lot of jussive and imperfect verbs, and there are a lot of vav consecutive verbs. And so that's why we spend a lot of time on that. Now, in this section of the slide, I want to try to show you that sometimes there is a connection between the independent pronoun, which you're learning for your final exam, and some of the ways that the verb prefixes and suffixes work. And the first example that I give you doesn't work well, but I think as you go along, you'll see that there is some relationship here. So in the first part of the slide, we have the pronoun he, which is who. We have an example root, kara, which means to call. And then you remember last week we talked about the vav consecutive. So a vav consecutive verb begins with a vav, and then the next Hebrew letter is the prefix, and the prefix refers to a pronoun. And in this case, yod is used, and it refers to he. And so the verb vayikra means and he called. And the perfect verb form of he happens to have no suffix. So it's just the plain form is the he form. Maybe somewhat analogous to the way you think of nouns. So masculine singular is the one that doesn't have anything added onto it. So in this case, the he form doesn't have anything added onto it either. So in this next slide, I think maybe this makes a little more sense, what I'm trying to accomplish here. So the independent pronoun for I is ani, and the example root is again, kara. And the Vav consecutive, if we want to say and I called, we would use the prefix aleph, which is the same way the independent pronoun begins with an aleph, so maybe that helps you remember that the prefix in Vav consecutive verbs is also aleph. So, and I called is vayekra. And then the suffix form in the perfect, I called, is kara plus t. Even though ani doesn't have a t, it ends in a yod. So maybe that yod ending there helps you remember that it is the I form, or just sort of the way they sound together. So if I wanted to say I called, I would say ani karati. Ani karati. They end in the same sound. Now, just to show you how a few of the other forms work, the they form, so the independent pronoun is haim. We have our example root. Now notice what it takes to take the Vav consecutive from he singular to they plural. And what the Vav consecutive does is it adds an u vowel on the end. So we get vayikra'u is and they called. So notice the difference between this one and he called is just a yod, but and they called is the yod plus the u vowel at the end. The perfect form just has the u at the end. So remember, perfect verbs only have suffixes. So if the masculine singular has no suffixes at all, adding an u maybe in this world makes sense to you to make it plural. Ata maybe works a little better. So ata is you, masculine singular. The Vav consecutive uses a tav as a prefix, but tikra is and you called. The perfect verb uses a suffix ta, which is karata. So ata karata. The word for y'all is atem. So we're going in the Vav consecutive from singular you, which was this, to plural you, which is this. So again, adding an u on the end to make it plural. And then the perfect form is karatem. Atem, karatem. So just to show these all together in one fell swoop, and just, I don't know, start to get familiar with the way the Vav consecutive forms work. If you know that they, for the Vav consecutive, if the next letter after the Vav is a yod, it means he, and then the verbal action in the past tense, you've conquered a huge number of verbs in the Bible because the Vav consecutive is very common, and you'll see, and the masculine singular forms are also very common.